Bits and Bones, my name is Lady V, and welcome to my channel. A few years back when I was getting into reading again and just sticking my toe into poetry, I wrote an article about what I think overly poetic poetry is. If you know, you know, and if you don't know, please stick around. I'll be reading this article out loud here and insert extra comments that I have now as I go, but you can also find this article through the link that I'll leave in the description below, which will redirect you to Medium. So here goes. What is overly poetic poetry? A look at Margaret Atwood's collection, The Circle Game. As I'm sure you've noticed, there's been a common theme in my recent articles as I explore the fascinating world of poetry for the first time. I've been very open about the conflicted perspective from which I see poetry, as I knew it as a child, and now as I'm rediscovering it as an adult. Poetry, much like math, was a subject taught to me from examples outside of the realm of practicality. Being good at math never brought parables into any aspect of my life that I could use them, much the same as analyzing poetry estranged me from wanting to write it. Poetry was distant, overly complicated, and not a life skill that I needed. In an unintended way, sharing my opinions on poetry, as I saw it as a child, is adding to the stigma of the genre as a whole. That said, I can't help but try to bridge the gap between poetry love and disdain that I know a lot of other young literature lovers experienced when schools gave us poetry and dissected it cold and bare on our desks in front of us, asked us to catalog the contents of its intestines and submit equations on its symbolism. I hated treating poetry like a lab animal, poking and prodding it for extra meaning, stripping every line for something that fits a thesis. Subsequently, I grew to hate poetry that demanded that treatment. Poetry that was so deeply convoluted it was impossible to understand on a surface level. That is, of course, the poetry I was given and what I believed poetry had to be. I realize some scholars and writers may have something akin to an analysis fix, where the harder it is to decipher or the deeper layered something is, the more joy they get unraveling it. This need to overanalyze is not uncommon, and tends to happen in any field, genre, or hobby one devotes themselves to. It's an eventuality. Fandoms are a symptom of this need. The given content is never quite enough. Fans want to spend more time with the content, so they search out more information, additional tidbits to feast on. Sure, knowing the entire family tree of the Targaryen house from Game of Thrones is cool, but do you know all their dragons' names, too? Loving content, and in turn wanting more from it, is a gyre of chaos that I'll discuss in a later article, but for now, I'd just like to acknowledge it and how it ruins classically taught poetry if you're at an impressionable age and that's how it's given to you. Enter Margaret Atwood. Margaret Atwood is one of the most recognizable Canadian names in current history. She is a poet, novelist, literary critic, essayist, teacher, environmental activist, and inventor, as listed by Wikipedia. But that's barely scratching the surface. Can I also mention screenwriter and powerfully influential feminist? But as the list goes, she is first and foremost described as a poet. I will be using one of Margaret Atwood's poems to deconstruct what I find so daunting about some forms of poetry because her work is so well known and revered, and she's a goddess who will take pity on me should she ever find this article. And a lot of her work shares characteristics of what put me off from poetry in my education. So we're going to take a look at the poem Carved Animals. Please note, this poem is the third in a three-part series on wood, stone, and then carved objects. Each are part of a theme but not dependent on one another. I picked this poem over other ones because it had a clear journey that I could analyze and where I got lost. Other poems in the Circle Game were not nearly so clear, but they were much harder to explain why they were not clear, even though they were so not clear. You know what I mean? If I'm so confused I can't even begin to describe what I'm trying to understand because I don't understand it, it makes for a much harder video essay. So, carved animals. The small carved animal is passed from hand to hand around the circle until the stone grows warm. Touching, the hands do not know the forms of animal which was made or the true form of stone uncovered. This poem starts with a very clear narrative and visual. There are people sitting in a circle, passing around a carved stone animal. I genuinely enjoy the beginning of this poem. It's a great mixture of poetic prose and progressive story, as we continue. And the hands, the fingers, the hidden small bones of the hands bent to hold the shape themselves grow. Cold from the stone's cold grow, also animal, exchange until the skin wonders if stone is human. Here we get more into line breaks and punctuation to accentuate something is happening fervently, spiritually. Although the description is indirect, it's easy to understand the concept. As they grow closer to the stone, part of them becomes the stone and vice versa. Lines between life and nature are blurred. In the darkness later, and even when the animal has gone, they keep the image of that inner shape. They're still thinking about it, internalizing it, easy enough to understand. Hand holding warm, hands holding the half-formed air. And the last two lines deter me from the poem. Yes, they felt themselves in the stone, the animal, the nature, and found some form of spirituality in themselves for it. Great. But what is half-formed air? I chose one of Atwood's easier poems where there was a narrative to follow, but throughout the collection, The Circle Game, I found an increasing occurrence of mashed up things. Half-formed air sounds good, like it might be a thing, but what is it? What am I actually visualizing? Everything usually makes sense until we get farther in. Explanations degrade, imagery muddles together, and I have too much to think about to know what's being said anymore. Where am I going, and where did I start? This is a very, very mild example of what I'm talking about. I was hoping to show how easy some parts of poetry can be, and how jarring it can be as soon as they deviate into something too flowery to understand. Air doesn't form. Ideas do. And that word would have suited the poem just fine, but poets choose not to use the easy word. Do I want to search around for a synonym so a piece of literature makes sense so that I can then enjoy it? No, unfortunately I don't. Shakespeare is Shakespeare for a reason. He has versions of his plays with more side margin text explaining what he's saying than the text itself, for a reason. People don't read him casually, for a reason. Please know, I honor and respect Margaret Atwood to the moon and back as a writer. I found that what I liked about her poetry was the vocabulary and description she used. Her poetry, however, was generally not for me. If you would like to read more of her poetry, the ones that I actually enjoyed the most from The Circle Game were This Is a Photograph of Me and The Explorers. So, it's hard to love and hate poetry. As with films and books, poetry has genres. Also, with films and books, poetry has fans that set strict hierarchies of what is good or to be expected. It has been a struggle as someone that couldn't or wouldn't touch poetry taught in my classes that simultaneously dislikes the degradation of literary expression in insta-poetry, to find a happy middle ground, to allow myself to love poetry at all. If you relate to my struggle at all with poetry, you have a right to like what you like as much as I have a right to dislike it. You don't have to define yourself to others to be accepted as a lover of poetry. Or anything, really. We all have our niches. Thank you for reading and taking a moment to try and understand what I, and I'm sure many others, describe as overly poetic poetry, where the stigma comes from, how it manifests, and why you shouldn't write off every piece of something you only dislike a percentage of. Because as much as I had that kind of crappy, dissecting-oriented upbringing with poetry in English class, and experienced overly poetic poetry that I couldn't get into in books that I later tried to find for myself, I have since read quite a lot of poetry books that I genuinely really enjoy. They are out there. It's just a matter of finding them. This article was not one written out of malice. It was written in hopes of bridging a connection with a lot of people who may feel poetry is untouchable because of its overly poetic qualities. It's not all like that. Poetry is diverse, and there is truly something for everyone. Poetry is the strangest, most diverse genre out there, and I, for one, am ready to find my place in it. So that's the end of the article. I know the poetry I chose to dissect was a very simple one, and complaining about the one specific instance of her saying half-formed air was extremely picky. But again, that was just a very tiny example that I was using so that it could be understood on a grander level. When I'm reading things like, this is half-formed air, this is toddle twat sunshine in a blue tree's trunk on a gravestone sort of thing, you know, like half-formed air was something very easy to point at and say there is a word for that. You chose not to use the word. You chose to make something up, which is a chronic problem of overly poetic poetry, I think, not just where they're plowing allusions or symbolism into things that don't necessarily need it for deeper layers, and then make what you're actually reading impossible to understand. But there's not just a simpler version of what you're trying to say, but a literal word for what you're trying to say, but you're choosing not to use it. Because as much as poetry is expected to be flowery, there is that saying with writers that sometimes it's not about using the biggest word, it's about using the best word for the situation. And overly poetic poetry tends to stick to not doing that. But as I mentioned, I have read a lot of poetry books since I wrote this article and read Margaret Atwood's. So sooner or later, I am going to make a video about the different kinds of modern poetry that I've run across that are not mainstream. We all know Rupi Kaur and R.H. Sin and then, Margaret Atwood. But that vast middle scope, that's where, if you're deterred by overly poetic poetry, I think you actually want to be. And I have some suggestions for that in a later video. Anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and a special thanks to my patrons. If you'd like to support me and my content, there is a link to my Patreon in the description below. Thanks again, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.